Okay, do we have these slides working the way they're supposed to?
I don't see them up on the screen just yet.
Okay, let me try to.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, very good.
Thanks
Well,
again.
it's certainly a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the help on the technical side. So I want to talk today about this idea of fasting, but I think we need to build a little bit of perspective first. And the place I'd like to start is understanding the difference between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. You know, people talk a lot about life expectancy, which is, the average age a person born today is likely to live. But what we probably should be talking about more of is healthy life expectancy. How long a person is going to live fully functional, able of taking care of themselves, enjoying their lives, rather than finding yourselves unable to talk or move lying in a nursing home bed somewhere. There's a big difference between healthy life expectancy and life expectancy. And how long a person lives is largely determined, it turns out, by genetics and luck. But how well people live in the time they have is largely determined by diet and lifestyle choices. There have been 109 billion modern humans, more or less, born on this planet. There are about 7.7 billion of us alive today, but there's only been well-documented evidence of 5 individuals living past 117. And even one of those is in question because they may have adopted the identity of their grandfather to avoid conscription into the military. So the idea that you're going to live beyond 117 currently is unlikely. The odds are approximately 1 in 20 billion. Odds would be better that you would live less than that. What that should bring our attention to is the fact that given that we have a limited amount of time left to live, the important focus is going to be how can we ensure that in those years that we have, we can be fully functional. In 1900, for example, life expectancy was 47. Today it's 78.6 and dropping. Actually, for the first time in recent years, life expectancy has actually been reducing in industrialized countries rather than the previous history of expansion. And we can talk about that later. But the reality is that there's 31 years more life expectancy today than in 1900. But adults live a little longer than they did in 1900. An adult 65 years old in 1900 could expect to live 12 years. Additionally, today it's about 19. So that's only a 7-year increase. And an 85-year-old, only about a 2-year increase. So the question is, if adults are only living a little longer, where did this 24-year difference go? And of course, the answer is that it's explained by a reduction in infant mortality. Instead of having 176 babies per 1,000 dying, now it's about 6 or 7 per 1,000 dying, which means children that in increasing numbers reach adulthood. And for every child that doesn't die in infancy, it adds 76 years to the average. It shifts the curve to the right. And in fact, of the 31-year increase in life expectancy, 24 years of it was due entirely to a reduction in infant and childhood mortality, not because adults are living longer. That additional difference is 7 years, and that's for all influences combined. So if you're thinking that the miracles of modern medicine are going to ensure you a long and productive life, you may be disappointed. In the United States, we spend more money on healthcare than any place else on the planet per capita. 2.5 times more than folks in the European Union. You would assume that if money correlated with health, that we should be the healthiest people on the planet, that both our life expectancy and our healthy life expectancy should be stellar, but they're not. The reality is our life expectancy lags those people that spend dramatically less on money, and our healthy life expectancy is also less, as you can see from this chart. As a reminder, life expectancy is how long an individual born today can live. Healthy life expectancies of that time, how much is going to be healthful and productive. Life expectancy of 78, healthy life expectancy is only 69. People spend 9.4 years in debility on average and 17 years in poor health. And it's that reduction in debility and poor health that we have the most likelihood of being able to influence. What we do, at least in the United States, is we spend most of our money treating the leading causes of death, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, instead of focusing on the actual causes of death, the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke, which is smoking, drinking alcohol, and eating an animal-rich diet full of complex carbohydrates, sugars, oils, and excess salt. If we were to spend more of our resources, our effort, our time, and our money on the actual causes of death, I predict that we would have a substantial reduction in the leading causes of death and at substantially more efficient cost. So if we look at the things that actually kill us, number one, of course, is tobacco. Tobacco is a fabulously efficient way of dying prematurely because it affects virtually every organ system in the body. When you think about tobacco, the first disease that comes to most people's minds is cancer of the lung. However, 80% of smokers never actually get lung cancer. Some people have suggested, well, maybe smoking is protecting people from getting lung cancer. And in a way, that's true because smoking is so effective at causing heart disease and killing people from heart attacks and strokes that they don't live long enough to grow their lung cancers. And so in a bizarre way, smoking's deadliness prevents many of its participants from getting the disease most commonly associated with it. High blood pressure, a little bit less efficient than tobacco, is causing premature death, and it mostly contributes to heart attacks and strokes. Alcohol consumption, you'll notice, is also a major cause of what's actually killing people. And yet today, if you look at the media, you would think that alcohol is some kind of health food. They tell you if you don't drink, you should start because alcohol thins the blood or is a rich source of resveratrol, a powerful antioxidant. And while it's true, alcohol does thin the blood, much like aspirin. So for people on high animal food diets at risk for clotting strokes, there's a slight reduction in the risk of clotting stroke. There's not an actual reduction in death because although you reduce the risk of clotting stroke, you increase the risk of bleeding or hemorrhagic stroke. I guess if your goal is to die from a hemorrhagic stroke rather than a clotting stroke, alcohol might have a legitimate role. Cholesterol levels are a marker for how much animal food you eat. The more animal food you eat in general, the higher your risk of dying. Overweight is not a healthful state, and obesity, in fact, is a major contributing cause of all-cause mortality. Low fruit and vegetable intakes, just not eating enough fruits and vegetables, is a major contributing cause of death, as is physical inactivity, illicit drugs, and unsafe sexual behaviors. So those are the things that are actually killing people. Those are the things that we need to put our effort into dealing with if our goal is to live a longer and healthier life. The reality is, though, that we now have an epidemic of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a condition or a syndrome where people have excess weight, as demonstrated by their increased waist circumference, elevated blood lipid levels, elevated blood pressure, or elevated blood glucose. And for people that have three or more of the variables on this chart, they have what is called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is unquestionably associated with everything from liver and colorectal cancer to gout and diabetes to stroke, congestive heart failure, myocardial infarction, coronary artery disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and many other diseases. In fact, even dying from infectious diseases, including COVID-19, is influenced by metabolic syndrome. So figuring out a way to effectively deal with this epidemic disease is, in fact, going to be one of the most important issues at preventing all-cause morbidity and mortality from these conditions. But as a society, we keep getting bigger. In 1986, shortly after I went into practice, there wasn't a single state in the United States with obesity saturation over 14%. Yet today, every state has managed to achieve that and more. In fact, now we have new colors showing the percentage of the population that have in fact achieved the exalted state of obesity. And what's interesting is these numbers actually underestimate the actual obesity because these are self-reported numbers. And it turns out people tend to be inaccurate and almost always underestimating their obesity, not overestimating it. So the reality is that people are much fatter than is indicated by this chart, but even this chart itself is rather shocking. 2/3 of people, in fact, are now overweight or obese. So if you are not overweight or obese, you are technically abnormal, because normal or average people are overweight. And it's not just the adipose tissue that's the problem. It's a particular type of fat that's most concerning, and that's visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat that collects around the belly, around the organs, is most associated with the inflammatory markers, including IL-6 and TNF alpha and all these other markers that have been identified associated essentially with inflammation. And the more you're obese, the more visceral fat you have, the higher your risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and others. The number of people in the United States of obesity is not only increasing, but all the diseases associated with it, as you would predict, are increasing. For example, if we look at the incidence of diabetes and compare it to the increasing obesity, the correlation coefficients are almost 1.0. It's almost like there's a connection. The fatter we get, the sicker we get. So what we're doing about it as a society is trying to convince people to eat health food. You know, olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and coffee and coconut, and, you know, getting people to follow high fat, high protein, Atkins paleo type diets. And unfortunately, although some of these approaches may be effective at short-term weight loss, they may not necessarily be long-term sustainable health promoting habits. In my opinion, what we should be doing is, instead of hawking health foods, we should be focusing on healthy foods. And healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food diet free of salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are actually not food. They're chemicals added to food that stimulate dopamine production in our brain that associated with pleasure. So it makes food more pleasurable to us, but not necessarily healthier. So we talk about a whole plant food SOS-free diet. SOS, of course, is the international symbol of danger, and it also includes salt, oil, and sugar. So we know that this pleasure trap, this artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain that comes from eating these highly processed foods, is leading people to obesity and metabolic syndrome. And that in turn is increasing people's dying from heart disease and cancer and autoimmune diseases, COVID-19, and everything else you can think of. So what are we going to do about it? Well, one practice that's been advocated is fasting. And there are some people like Walter Longo and others that have done tremendous research looking at a version of fasting called intermittent fasting, where people essentially limit their feeding window to between 8 and 12 hours a day. So if you limit your feeding window to, say, 8 hours a day, that would mean you'd have a 16-hour fast every day. And even that period of fasting, even that brief period of 16 hours of fasting, day after day after day, is thought to induce changes that are consistent with disease prevention, health promotion. Also very effective at helping aid people who are attempting to lose or maintain optimum weight. The way you would implement intermittent fasting essentially is by not eating 3 or 4 hours before you go to bed at night, perhaps delaying breakfast a little bit until you can get some exercise time in, and limit your feeding window to that 8 to 12 hour period. What I'm going to be speaking about at this point, though, is not intermittent fasting, but water-only fasting. So water-only fasting is defined as the complete abstinence from all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. Now, this type of fasting is taking that intermittent fasting and extending it for a longer period of time. Now, an important consideration when we're talking about longer-term fasting, particularly extended fasting, is that not everybody is a great candidate for fasting, that for some people this could be detrimental. So it's important to know if an individual is a good candidate for fasting before we undertake fasting for periods of anywhere from 5 to 40 days. And the way you determine that is with a medical history, a physical exam, and basic laboratory evaluation. This not only helps us determine who's a good candidate for fasting, but provides us the information necessary to monitor fasting patients to ensure that the process is going along properly. So there are some conditions and some individuals that would not be good candidates for fasting at a given point. If you're pregnant or lactating, fasting's not generally for you. If you're lactating and you fast, you're going to lose milk production. That's going to be a problem. If you have anorexia nervosa, which is a neurological condition, we would recommend against fasting. Even though these patients want to fast, it's not a health promoting intervention for that condition. If you have type 1 diabetes, that is, you don't produce enough insulin, you wouldn't be able to fast because you need a certain amount of insulin to be able to adapt to the fasting process. If you've had a recent stroke or myocardial infarction, if you had a pulmonary embolism, DVT, cardiac instability, or atrial fibrillation, fasting may not be the best thing for you because you're likely on anticoagulant therapy, which if you discontinue that rapidly can result in very negative outcomes. And so, these individuals may have to be stabilized before they would be candidates for water-only fasting. If you have severe kidney disease, the kidneys are a very important organ in your body. They purify the blood, essentially. And that's where most toxins that are in the body and that are going to be eliminated are eliminated through. You get a little bit through your stools, a little bit through the skin, but mostly it's through the urine, which is the byproduct of the blood being filtered by the kidneys. So if you don't have adequate kidney function, you may not be able to adapt safely to the fasting process. So it's important to measure kidney function before undergoing long-term fasting. If you have genetic defects, if you have porphyria, if you have medium chain acetylcoenzyme dehydrogenase deficiency, you wouldn't be able to fast because you wouldn't be able to break down fatty acids and you would develop nausea, vomiting, and then you would die, and that would be a bad thing. So we always test patients before fasting to make sure they don't have any of the things that would contraindicate fasting successfully. If you have deficiency, depletion, or cachexia, or you're on medications that can't be safely discontinued, fasting may not be for you. And if you can't rest, you shouldn't fast. It's very important for people to rest when they fast. If you rest when you fast, the majority of calories are burned from fat with a preferential focus on visceral fat. If you're very active when you're fasting, what you do is you force a process called gluconeogenesis. That's the breakdown of protein to provide the sugar that's needed by this extra activity, both from your brain and your muscles. And so then you would deplete vital reserves rather than focus on fat and fat mobilization. So the conditions that are most favorable to fasting, not surprisingly, are the conditions that are caused by dietary excess. Obesity, elevated blood levels, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, as well as metabolic syndrome that we've talked about. Some conditions like lymphoma, which is a type of lymph cancer, respond well to fasting, and we'll discuss some of the outcome data that we've had experience with there. Gastrointestinal imbalances and alterations in the microbiome. It's interesting, humans have about 5 pounds of bacteria that live in their intestinal tract. That's 1 trillion creatures. That's a lot of creatures. And these are living creatures that are eating and drinking and defecating inside you. I mean, when you really think about it, you've got 1 trillion creatures pooing inside your intestinal tract right now as we speak. And what they poo in you could be toxic waste, things like TMA, which becomes TMAO and can increase your risk of dying from colon cancer and heart disease. Or you could be pooing fertilizer in you, things like vitamin K and stuff you need to survive. And what determines what your organisms, what your microbiome poo in you depends on what you feed them. So we know if you feed them animal foods, meat, fish, fowl, and eggs, and dairy products, you get a completely different microbiome than people that are on plant-based diets. So one of the reasons why animal food consumers may have such a higher incidence of many diseases is in part because of the alterations in the microbiome. Healthy microbiome have maybe 1,000 different species of organisms. And it's thought that the broader your diversity, the more resilient and resistant you are to everything from heart disease and cancer to COVID-19. But when you feed the microbiome sugar, refined carbohydrates, animal foods, you alter the constituents in that flora tremendously. And then other things like antibiotics can actually have a devastating effect on the type of organisms and how they survive. So this becomes a very important process. And fasting actually reboots the entire microbiome. It's really quite fascinating. In fact, we've done the first research on the effect of long-term fasting on the gut microbiome. We did a study with Luigi Fontana from Washington University, and that study will be published later this year. Autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases are diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, and ulcerative colitis, and ankylosing spondylitis, and lupus, and psoriasis, eczema, and asthma, and these conditions where it's actually your immune system attacking your own tissues that's responsible for the manifestations of disease. And so it turns out in fasting, there's a number of things that we'll discuss today that change, that are favorable at bringing autoimmune diseases under control. And then, of course, dependency and toxicity. Many people are addicted to things like drugs, like alcohol, like cocaine, and even to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain that comes from chemicals out of the food, like sugar and oil. And so these dependencies can be rebooted with fasting. In fact, fasting is like taking a hard drive on a computer that's become corrupted. And if you reboot the hard drive, you turn the machine off, you turn it on, you don't always know exactly why, but now things start working better. And that's a reasonable analogy in humans. You shut everything down with fasting, you turn it back on, and you're able to create an environment that's more conducive for health recovery. So fasting duration is anywhere from 2 to 40 days. We limit fasting at the TrueNorth Health Center to generally 40 days. During that period of time, you can have safe and effective experiences. You start doing longer fasts than that, it gets a little bit more complicated. Average fasts range from 1 to 3 weeks. Some patients require multiple fasts. Now, there's a lot of mistaken ideas about fasting. And at the TrueNorth Health Center, with research that's being done by the TrueNorth Health Foundation, our 501c3 nonprofit research organization, we've been able to answer some of those old wives' tales and mistaken beliefs. One of those is about body composition changes during fasting. Now, we were able to obtain a DEXA scanner and do detailed body composition analysis of individuals going through a study that we conducted on fasting. And essentially what we found in this study was that, yes, patients lose both lean tissue and fat during fasting. And you can see from this composition trend here that lean tissue goes down during fasting, as does fat. What's interesting, as you break the fast and begin refeeding, lean tissue recovers, but fat loss continues. And so not only do people lose fat during fasting, but they lose a particular type of fat called visceral fat. And the ratio that visceral fat is burned compared to adipose tissue is actually higher in fasting than anything else that's been demonstrated to date. It's actually almost 3 to 1. And so what ends up happening is people lose a bunch of weight during fasting. Some of it's protein, some of it's water, some of it's fiber, some of it's glycogen, and some of it's fat. They come off the fast, they regain their water, their glycogen, their protein, their fiber, but the fat loss continues. So that if you look at people at the end of fasting, this particular individual lost 12% of total weight, 20 or 18% of fat loss, but over 54% of their visceral fat, of their entire visceral fat load, and only 4% of lean tissue. And then on recovery, they recover that lean tissue and more. In fact, at 6 weeks in the study that we've done, we found that the lean tissue mass was actually higher at 6-week follow-up than it was prior to fasting, even though the fat loss had actually continued. So it's really a way of reformulating the body, getting rid of the fat, particularly the visceral fat, and allowing for recovery of the glycogen, water, fiber, and protein. The problem is, of course, you do need to eat healthfully after the fasting. If you go back to a greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet based on refined carbohydrates and processed foods, you will, in fact, go back into getting the problems that you had before. So, conclusion of this study is that the larger percentage of visceral fat was lost compared to subcutaneous fat, that the loss continued through refeeding of fat, No other method has been identified as efficient a means of mobilizing visceral fat. And we are, in fact, conducting more research on this very issue. We're also looking at some of the biomarkers, things like adenopectin and others that indicate inflammation and associated with visceral fat. And we're looking forward to running those analyses. Another condition that's a major contributing cause of death and disability, in fact, the leading cause of death and disability, and if you include the conditions associated with it, is high blood pressure. High blood pressure and the conditions associated with high blood pressure kill more people than any other in industrialized society. For example, 5.7 million people have congestive heart failure, of which 287,000 die each year. And blood pressure is the major preventable factor. Congestive heart failure, when your heart muscle doesn't pump the blood efficiently enough. So, for example, if you were to lie down with congestive heart failure, your lungs would fill with fluid. So people have to literally like sleep sitting up if they have congestive heart failure as a consequence of this imbalance. And stroke, over 800,000 people this year will have strokes, and high blood pressure is in fact a major preventable reason why people have strokes. What's shocking is that 40% of people over 25 now have high blood pressure, and 63% over 60. So if you're 60 and you don't have hypertension, you are abnormal. High blood pressure is the leading justification for visits to physicians and justification for prescription medications. This thing is worth billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical industry. But drug intervention is actually largely disappointing, with improved outcomes only for those with the highest levels of hypertension, and mostly because of its effect to reduce stroke slightly for people with elevated blood pressure levels. It doesn't do as good a job on cardiac arrest. And in fact, the majority of people that have heart attacks and strokes from high blood pressure actually have blood pressure that's not high enough to justify medications. So if your blood pressure is 138/88, your risk of dying taking blood pressure medications may be higher than your risk of dying from a heart attack as a consequence of high blood pressure, which is why they don't recommend blood pressure medications until your blood pressure rises to quite a high level, high enough to justify the benefit versus the risk of taking medication. For every point your systolic blood pressure is reduced by diet and lifestyle, there's a 1% reduction in all-cause mortality, and that risk may go down as low as 90/60. So blood pressure of 120/80, if you make diet and lifestyle changes, your blood pressure will likely lower even further. And that further reduction is associated with a further reduction in all-cause mortality. Now, despite this, the reality is this is how we manage blood pressure. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 different medications. And these medications have serious side effects like chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and actually death. People die from taking the blood pressure medications at a high enough rate that they have to wait till your risk factor of dying from stroke is high enough to justify that risk. And what's really frustrating is if you go to a doctor and they put you on these medications, they will tell you that you will have to be on these drugs forever, that you will be sick for the rest of your life, that you will never recover. It's said that according to one of the major medical society's websites, people with hypertension can't be cured because there's no underlying cause for the high blood pressure. Therefore, there is nothing that can be fixed to resolve it. And yet, our experience has been very different. If you look at the medical literature, there's a number of things that have shown to reduce blood pressure: weight loss, vegetarian high fiber diets, not drinking alcohol. Even 2 drinks a week are enough to measurably elevate an individual's blood pressure. Exercise lowers blood pressure almost as effectively as any combination of medications, which do lower blood pressure, an average of 12 points systolic blood pressure, but at a cost of chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and actual death. Sodium restriction, if it's done aggressively to less than 1 milligram of sodium per calorie, can reduce blood pressure even more effectively than medications. John McDougall did a study at St. Helena Hospital combining a vegan, low-fat, low-salt diet and exercise, and he found an effect size as large as anything until we did a study with T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, where we used medically supervised water-only fasting along with a whole plant food diet, and we're able to demonstrate the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating high blood pressure in humans in a paper that was published in JMPT, medically supervised water-only fasting in the treatment of hypertension. We took 174 consecutive patients, and 174 people achieved low enough pressure to eliminate the need for medication, with an average effect size of stage 3 hypertension of over 60 points. And of course, if the blood pressure was more moderate, the results were proportional. We published a second study, medically supervised water-only fasting in the treatment of borderline hypertension, which was treating people that didn't yet have blood pressure high enough to justify the risk of medication, but still high enough to increase the risk of dying. And those individuals, 68 people, underwent medically supervised fasting, and they were able to achieve, all of them achieved normal blood pressure, 82% below 120/80. None of them required medication. And this was our second paper on hypertension. As a consequence of those first two studies, we were approached by the International Union of Operating Engineers, California's largest, perhaps most powerful labor union, people that build your highways and whatnot. And they asked us to consider making our program a fully covered medical benefit for the International Union of Operating Engineers. We presented our data, and they asked us if we could make the program available, but also do a study. And so we took the first 30 consecutive patients that they submitted to us. They fasted an average of 3 weeks. They lost 26 pounds on average. Their blood pressure was down 30/11 on follow-up. They had maintained an additional 2 pounds of weight loss. They maintained much of their blood pressure reduction. And what the union was excited about was the entire cost of the program. They saved more money than the entire cost of the program in the first year alone, just in reduced medical cost and drug savings. I remember the very first gentleman they sent to us from the union was a gentleman with obesity, hypertension and diabetes, 220/120 blood pressure, capped out on 5 meds. When he came to us, he was the very first person they referred, and they forgot to tell him one very important thing, and that was what the program was. So he showed up at the TrueNorth Health Center not knowing what was going to happen. And he looked around and he thought, oh no, he's in the wrong place. But I assured him he was in the right place, that I had his name on the list, and that he had, serious health problems and he was here to get well. He assured me he was not sick. And I said, you are sick. You've got blood pressure of 220/120. You're carrying a keg around in your belly in the terms of obesity, and that he was not only sick, but that he was going to die. And his response to me was, well, aren't we all going to die? And of course, that was a valid point. We are all going to die at some point. But I explained to him that his demise was going to be much sooner rather than later if he didn't make changes. I also assured him that if he were willing to make these changes, the $880 worth of medications he spent a month could be reduced or eliminated. He explained that he didn't care about the cost of his medications because they were paid for by his insurance, not by him. At this point, I realized this was not my normal, highly motivated, self-selected patient that I'm used to dealing with. So I thought about his medical history a little bit and realized the way to motivate him might be to address one of his problems, which is very common, in particularly males that are on a lot of diabetes and hypertension medication, which is impotence. And I said, if we get you off all those drugs and get you healthy, there's a chance we could do something about your little problem. At that point, he stood up and I got a little nervous because he was a big guy. And he said, well, why the hell didn't you just say so? So I realized I had his attention. But when we had taken his medical history, he told me that his diet was this picture I've got right here, except that this stuff here, if they made a mistake and put any of that lettuce on there, he would take that off and throw it away because he didn't like lettuce. But he was a triple cheeseburger guy. And so we realized before we fasted him, we would need to feed him some real food. And we did. And we got him some food from the TrueNorth Health salad bar and hot bar. And he tried to eat it, but it looked like he couldn't actually swallow the food. He was like, and I thought for a second, perhaps he had a tumor we had missed. But then I realized he just didn't like the food. And when I sat down next to him, I asked him, I said, it looks like you're having trouble with the food. He said, what food? He said, this is not food. He said, this is disgusting. And if I have to eat tasteless swill like this the rest of my life, I'd rather just die. And he told me I should go out to his truck where I would find his 12 gauge and I should bring it in. And when he's not looking, just shoot him in the head. So we checked him in. And he ended up fasting 26 days. He lost almost 50 pounds. He normalized his blood sugar, his blood pressure. We got him off his meds. And when we were done, we fed him the same kind of food that we fed him when he came in, but this time he was able to eat the food. And when I sat down next to him, I said, "It looks like you're doing a little bit better with the food." He said, "Yep, your chef's finally getting the idea." It took me 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food that we had served him before his fast. And he absolutely couldn't believe it. He said, "No, that other stuff was disgusting." He said, "This was not bad." And, this is a gentleman that wouldn't have complied for a meal, let alone long enough to actually neuroadapt to a healthy diet, but he did. And I saw him 6 months later at a semi-annual blood pressure screening we were doing for the union. I asked him how he was doing. He said he was doing just fine. So the question is, okay, somebody got well, but is it safe? Can you actually fast people for up to 40 days on water only safely? And the answer is yes. And in order to really definitively answer that question, what we did is we did a study. And that study appeared in the medical literature just a few years ago. And it was called, "Is Fasting Safe? A chart review of adverse events during medically supervised water-only fasting." And what we did is we took every patient every day for 5 years, and we charted all of their adverse events. And we used the common terminology criteria for adverse events from the American Cancer Society, where every patient, every day, you chart every symptom according to these standardized issues. And those are CTCAE grading system, where every symptom is given a grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you have a symptom, a mild symptom, maybe you have a headache, you might get a grade 1 for that symptom. If you have a moderate symptom, like you have nausea, you might get a grade 2. If you had a more severe symptom, like a hypertensive crisis, for example, if your systolic blood pressure on that day was over 160, you might get a category 3. If you had a potentially life-threatening event, you'd get a category 4. And if you die that day, you get a category 5 event for your death. So what we did is we took all these patients for 5 years, and we found there were a total of 5,949 adverse events. Now, most of those events were category 1 and 2 events, normal symptoms of fasting that you expect to occur. There were 310, medically significant events. There was 1 category 4 event, and there were no deaths. Now, of the 310 more medically significant adverse events, many of those were hypertensive crises. Actually, about 100 of those were hypertensive crises. And you might wonder, why would a person have a hypertensive crisis, that is, their systolic blood pressure rises over 160, if they're fasting for high blood pressure? Well, here's how it works. If you come in and your blood pressure starts at 220, like our union guys did, and the next day it goes down to, say, 210, and the next day it goes down to 200, and the next day it's down to 190, and the next day it's down to 185, and the next day it's down to 175. Well, every one of those days is an adverse event and a reportable event. See, because it's an arbitrary standard. Anytime there's a blood pressure, for whatever reason, is over 160, that's reportable. And so it turns out most of our reportable events in this category 3 were people that were having problems that were in the process of resolving, but still qualified as adverse events. There was 1 category 4 event. That was a hyponatremic event. That is, a person's blood sodium level went too low. Because we monitored that, we caught it, easily corrected it. But it's the kind of thing, if you weren't monitoring it, it could have become serious or even life-threatening. And there were no deaths during fasting. So the conclusion of this study was that the majority of adverse events are mild to moderate. They're known to occur during fasting. They're expected. There was a slight correlation between age and the number of adverse events, but not so much severity, which was important because up until this time, anybody that was, say, 65 and older was considered too old to be able to participate in a study of fasting. Whereas now we know that even if the person's older, if they're 65, 70, 75, that they're not more likely to have serious adverse events than the younger person, and therefore there's no reason to exclude them from this process. And this safety study was important because not only did it allow us to do research that could be published on fasting, but allows any researchers using this protocol to conduct fasting research. And in fact, it's interesting because Walter Longo, who wrote a book on fasting, talks about intermittent fasting mostly and cautioned people about long-term fasting because of its danger. The caveat, he said, was if it was done at the TrueNorth Health Center. Now, I evaluate others, people's, particularly researchers' intelligence based on how much they agree with me. So that makes Dr. Longo a genius. And so the bottom line is, if this protocol is used, other people, in addition to us, can expect to be able to get IRBs or Human Subjects Committee to approve fasting based on this fasting safety study. So then the question is, okay, so it's safe, you can do it, it works for conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes. What's actually going on in fasting? Well, some things are obvious. Weight loss, for example, you lose a pound a day. And although that weight loss is made up of fat, visceral fat, protein, water, fiber, and glycogen, we now know from our body composition studies that the fat that's lost continues and the lean tissues recover. Natriuresis is the selective mobilization and elimination of excess salt from the system. Many people add salt to their foods. They have excess salt in their bodies, and that salt causes, because it has a highly irritating material, which causes the body to retain water, and that water increases blood volume, which is why sodium increases risk of hypertension. Also non-healing wounds and congestive heart failure and all kinds of other problems. Well, the body selectively gets rid of this excess salt during fasting very quickly. It's a very powerful natriuretic effect, actually more powerful even than diuretics that are used. And so as a consequence, the blood volume goes down, the blood pressure comes down, the non-healing wound starts to heal, the congestive heart failure starts to ease, and people start to heal very rapidly. Detoxification occurs during fasting. People are actually toxic. Now, people say, well, wait a second, what do you mean toxic? Well, if you take a fat biopsy of a human, you'll find there's several hundred different chemicals, things like PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues, heavy metals, etc. And when you fast, those processes are rapidly mobilized and then eliminated, most of it being processed by the kidneys and being eliminated in the urine. And there's two kinds of toxins, the endogenous toxins, which are normal intermediary products of metabolism, like cholesterol and things that aren't actually poisons, but in too much quantity in the wrong place, they may present a problem. And then there's exogenous toxins that we talked about, like PCB, dioxins, et cetera. Those are rapidly mobilized and eliminated. Now, some people will tell you they're so rapidly mobilized that it would be dangerous, that your body wouldn't be able to process it. And they say that unless you take their proprietary products, their magic pills and potions, then you wouldn't want to do a fast. That's not been our experience at all. The fact is the body is evolved to be able to fast. In fact, all the humans that couldn't fast died. In our evolutionary past, the human brain, as being the large bulbous neuronal net that it is our biggest burner of glucose. And if you can't fast, that means you could only go about a week where you deplete your protein reserves. Because we can change our brain fuel from burning fat to burning sugar to burning fat, that allows us to preserve our resources. And that's why a slender human male, 70-kilogram male, can fast up to 70 days, unlike a chimpanzee, which would only last about a week. And that's why you'll never see chimps leaving the tropics, where they have a ready supply of year-round food. Because the first time spring came late, all the humans with our large bulbous neuronal net brains, they died. And that's why we call it a biological adaptation, because virtually every human has this ability to make this conversion. Enzymes are necessary for doing a couple things: mobilizing macronutrients like fat and glycogen and protein. For example, if you are a trained athlete, you get good at mobilizing glycogenolysis, mobilizing glycogen, because you induce or catalyze these enzyme reactions. Because every time you go out and exercise, you push the system and require mobilization of glycogen stores. Well, you do the same thing when you're fasting. You force the body to mobilize its glycogen stores, you force the body to mobilize its fat stores. And so those enzyme systems become catalyzed and are facilitated. And that makes it so that you're able to mobilize fat and glycogen more effectively after fasting, not just during fasting. And the same thing's true with toxins. toxins are enzymatically isolated, mobilized, and eliminated. And so the detoxifying enzyme pathways are induced during fasting, and they persist after fasting. And that may be one of the reasons why even intermittent fasting, where you're fasting for a brief period, like 16 hours, part of the benefit may be inducing these nutrient and toxin mobilizing systems, and that day after day after day, you get better and better at it. And certainly with long-term fasting, the effects are very profound and are cumulative. So every time a person does a longer fast, they'll be better than they were the last time at mobilizing these pathways. Insulin is a hormone. It drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells where it's needed to burn. If your insulin doesn't work, your blood sugar levels would rise, and we call that diabetes mellitus. Type 2 diabetics actually make more, not less insulin. It just doesn't work. And the reason is people have too much fat in general and too much visceral fat in particular. And the big problem is the diet that makes you fat contributes to insulin resistance. So you don't have to lose all the fat to reduce your insulin resistance, but you do have to change the diet. And the moment you change the diet from the highly processed foods and animal foods that dominate most people's diets to a whole plant food SOS-free diet, the body begins losing weight. We know that on average, with moderate activities, males will lose about 3 pounds a week, females about 2 pounds a week. Men with their higher testosterone levels are basically fat-burning machines, whereas women with their high estrogen content are essentially energy-conserving fat storage devices, biologically speaking. So that's why it does take a lot more effort for the average woman, everything else being able to lose weight compared to the average male. The gut, we've talked about the microbiome already in the gut, the 5 pounds of organisms that live in this intestinal mucosa. There's a membrane in there that is designed to filter everything that comes into it. So nothing gets through the filter of the gut if it's too large. And it's basically a very fine screen that's designed, for example, even a protein molecule is too large to get through the microbiome, intestinal mucosal membrane. It would have to be amino acids. It filters bacteria, it filters all kinds of things except, glucose and protein and nutrients, the things you want to be entering into your bloodstream. And it works very much like a screen works to keep a fly out. If the fly is bigger than the holes, nothing gets through. But the problem is if something damages the screen or damages the intestinal mucosa, then the spaces become bigger and things can leak through. It's termed gut leakage, where proteins and bacteria, other organisms can leak through into your intestinal and stimulate the immune system to have to protect you. But that's okay because you have an immune system and they'll send in macrophages and they'll surround things and bind things and eat things. And that protects you and does a pretty good job, except that if you keep doing that day after week after month, eventually you can debilitate your immune response. Or if you're genetically vulnerable, your immune system can become confused and then begin to react not only to these foreign tissues, but begin to react to your own tissues. And that's essentially what autoimmune disease is, where your immune system begins attacking your tissues. And if it attacks your joints, we might call it rheumatoid arthritis. If it attacks your lungs, we might call it asthma. If it attacks your kidneys, maybe it's lupus, or your skin, it might be called vasculitis. Lots of different names, same basic process, your immune system being confused, attacking your own cells. Now, the medical management of these diseases is very powerful. You take drugs like steroids or anti-cancer drugs that shut down the immune system. And at first it's like a dream because your symptoms go away. And then it becomes a nightmare because it turns out you need your immune system. And if you shut your immune system down with powerful medications, eventually the effect of the medications may be worse than the effect of the disease itself. And that's why long-term autoimmune disease treatment is kind of a nightmare. So better than suppressing the immune response, what we believe is you want to get rid of the things that damage the intestinal mucosa and allow for the gut leakage. If you look at this picture, you see that one person has prematurely aged, one image. And that's what we call smoker's face. Because when people smoke cigarettes, they bathe their body with something called free radicals. And it causes cross-linkaging tissue of collagen tissues. And that's what wrinkles are, is cross-linked collagen tissues that come from free radicals. So when you smoke, you get to get the nice wrinkled look. If you don't smoke, you age at a more normal rate. And that's actually one of the reasons why we talked about smoking helps protect people from lung cancer, because the free radicals cause the enamel lining of the vessels to be damaged. And so people have little clots that cause heart attacks and stroke. And that's what kills them before they can develop the lung tumors, which may take a little bit longer to grow. So free radicals from smoking would be one source of free radicals. And they, of course, don't just affect the face. They age your entire body, not just the face, but also the intestinal mucosal lining. And so that may be an important part of gut leakage. So you could smoke cigarettes, you could drink alcohol, because the peroxidation of alcohol also bathes the body with free radicals, which is why drinkers of alcohol get cirrhosis of the liver or fatty liver. There's also viruses like hepatitis, which can lead to that as well. Interestingly enough, hepatitis, especially NASH, non-alcoholic hepatitis, can also respond to fasting. And in part because dealing with this gut leakage issue affects autoimmune diseases all the way down the chain. So in fasting, the intestinal mucosa gets to heal. And then, of course, after fasting, we want to avoid the smoking, the drinking, the animal foods, the heated fats, the fried foods, the things that give the body this excess exposure to free radicals. And of course, a whole plant food SOS-free diet is also a diet rich in antioxidants that help your body kind of neutralize them. We want to be careful, though, about assuming that because the diet providing antioxidants protects the body, that necessarily taking supplements protects the body. For example, vitamin A has powerful antioxidant effects in the form of beta carotene from the diet is highly health promoting, but taking supplemental vitamin A actually can be health compromising. And in most studies that have been done looking at supplementing vitamin A in terms of treating cancer, the patients supplemented with A die at a higher rate, not a lower rate than the others, because there's a completely different process that goes on when you take vitamin supplements versus getting whole natural food diet. The sympathetic tone is important as well. The autonomic nervous system in the body controls all the things you don't normally think about. So, for example, if you go out running and your heart didn't speed up, you would die because you wouldn't get adequate blood flow. But your heart knows that and automatically speeds up. And what controls that is the autonomic nervous system. It has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, and they have to be in balance with each other. So if the sympathetic tone, for example, is too high, you might have symptoms like constipation. If the parasympathetic tone is too high, you may have symptoms like diarrhea. So the important thing is to get those systems balanced. And the most powerful way of balancing the autonomic nervous system that I've ever discovered is fasting. It's like we talked about rebooting the hard drive in a computer. When you fast, the autonomic parasympathetic sympathetic balance tends to become restored. Psychospiritual, isn't it interesting that religions, the Jews, the Jains, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Christians, they don't agree on much, but one thing they do have in common is that fasting can affect both physical and spiritual psychological impact. And so there's a tradition of fasting in virtually every major religion. The immune system is actually enhanced, not suppressed during fasting. And autophagy, which turns out to be a very important process associated with protecting you from disease and cancer. In fact, the Nobel Prize in 2016, Yoshinori Oshumi got for his work on autophagy. And it turns out that fasting is one of the ways of dramatically enhancing autophagy. And then we talked already about taste neuroadaptation, the idea that people get addicted to the artificial stimulation of salt, oil, and sugar. And this is a way of readapting their taste buds so that good foods taste good. So these are many of the mechanisms that we believe are going and taking place during fasting. And we actually did a study on this last one on taste adaptation, where we determined minimum threshold to salt and sugar, and then saw what happened to the taste perceptions after fasting. And our data showed that a liking of salty fatty and sweet fatty foods changed dramatically as a consequence of fasting, making it much easier to get people to adapt, as our union member did, to a health promoting diet. So the other question is, does everything go down in fasting? Not everything. Some things go down, some things go up. Things that we know go down in fasting are glucose and insulin. We know that IGF-1, which is insulin growth factor 1, also associated with disease processes, also reduces during fasting. Leptin goes down, and that's associated with reduced inflammation. The blood pressure, the heart rate, and mTOR, which is mammalian target of rapamycin, goes down in fasting. And the lower your mTOR, the higher your autophagy. That may be the mechanism why fasting increases autophagy, is because of its effect on mTOR. Microbial loads, we already talked about rebooting the gut microbiome in the intestinal tract. There's a big reduction initially during fasting, and then after fasting, feeding a whole plant food diet, you end up growing back your diverse strain of bacteria that are associated with positive health results. Inflammatory markers, including IL-6 and TNF alpha and all kinds of other exotic markers that are being studied now, tend to be reduced with fasting, as is inflammation and oxidative damage in general. Fasting reduces all of the abnormalities that are associated with metabolic syndrome. It's the most effective way of getting people out of this syndrome that's making people vulnerable to disease and debility. So some things go up in fasting. Adenopectin and ghrelin, and their increase is associated with improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammation. Some of the processes get complex, like AMPK, which is activated protein kinase, downregulates something called PGC1 alpha, which is peroxisome proliferator activated receptor, and that increases mitochondrial biogenesis. What does that mean? It means that the actual mitochondria, the energy producing components in the cells, are enhanced during fasting. And that may be one of the reasons that we see patients with chronic fatigue. And like right now, we're treating a lot of long COVID, where people had COVID, but they didn't fully recover and they've got brain fog and fatigue. And you fast those patients, and remarkably enough, they recover. In fact, we have a fascinating case report that will be coming out next month that looks at a 40-day fast in a 2-year history of long COVID in an individual that had all kinds of detailed biomarkers before and after fasting. And very interesting, the changes that occur with fasting. BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That is an agent that protects the nerves in the brain from damage associated with, Alzheimer's disease and dementia. In fact, it was an interesting study that were done with rats, where they put rats, genetically bred rats, in cages, identically fed, but one set of rats was given a wheel so it could exercise, and the ones that exercised didn't get Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And they wanted to know why. And they found out is because the exercise dramatically increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it turns out that exercise prevents those rats from getting dementia. The other thing that increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor is fasting. Excuse me. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting is many of the things that improve with exercise also improve with fasting. And you might say, well, why would that be? With fasting, you're resting, and exercise, you're vigorously active. What do fasting and exercise have in common? Well, what they have in common is they both help undo the consequence of dietary excess. Fasting and exercise both undo the consequence of dietary excess, and dietary excess is what inhibits things like BDNF and other variables. Well, the reason why BDNF goes up in fasting is because the higher your beta-hydroxybutyrate, the higher your BDNF production, and But beta-hydroxybutyrate is what the brain is burning during fasting. That's what your brain fuel focuses on. There's also cellular stress resistance and adaptation that improve in fasting. That was demonstrated in the study with rats. They had 30 rats in 2 groups, identical in every way, and they all had cancer. And they gave the first group of rats enough chemotherapy to kill all the cancer cells. You have to kill all the cancer cells because otherwise the cancer grows back. But in killing all the cancer cells, you also kill all the rats because the toxicity from the chemotherapy. Took the same rats, the same cancer, the same chemotherapy, but this time did fasting before, during, and after the chemotherapeutic administration, and all 30 rats survive, and dramatically enhancing cancer-free survival. Because what fasting did is it made the cancer cells more vulnerable to the effects of chemotherapy, but in the meantime, it protected the healthy cells from the damages of chemotherapy. Cellular stress resistance and cellular stress adaptation. I mentioned Yoshinori Ishimi, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2016. That was for his work on autophagy, which we mentioned was enhanced during fasting, and the gut microbiome diversity and the stimulation of B-cell immunity. So these are some of the things that we're learning. Now, many of these papers have only been published in the last few years, about why it is that for the last 40 years that we've been fasting people, we've been seeing people that are sick get well. According to Walter Longo, published in Journal of Metabolism in 2015, the combination of fasting and chemotherapy results in dramatically higher cancer-free survival than chemotherapy alone. I'm going to have just enough time here to go through a couple quick case reports, and then we'll have time, hopefully, to answer your questions. This was a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal, case reports in 2015. It was a water-only fasting in the treatment of stage 3 follicular lymphoma. This was a young woman that came to us, 42 years old, had been diagnosed and been tracked for 2 years with progressive lymph cancer. She'd been confirmed with excisional biopsy. She'd been tracked and well-documented tumor masses. Despite the fact that her oncologist and her doctor told her that diet didn't matter, she could eat whatever she wanted, and that fasting was criminal quackery, she decided to come to the center, fasted for 21 days on water only, had a 10-day recovery, during which time her palpable tumors completely disappeared. She lost 22 pounds in that 3-week fast, and at follow-up, she had maintained and lost an additional 13 pounds by following a whole plant food SOS-free diet. She had a little bit of residual mild neutropenia. Her white count was slightly low. By 6 months, her white counts had normalized. She'd lost additional weight by maintaining the diet. And at 12 months, she had this follow-up scan that showed a dramatic reduction in her masses. She, at this point, we wrote an article up on our experience with fasting in follicular lymphoma. It was published by the British Medical Journal, but they asked us to follow her for 3 years because they said a small percentage of people spontaneously go into remission, and we wanted to make sure it was sustained. And so we followed this patient after this paper was published for 3 years, and were able to get a whole body CT. And I'm happy to say she was completely cancer-free. And just a few weeks ago, we managed to get a 6-year follow-up on this individual, and she continues to be cancer-free. Now, since this was published, we've treated a large number of patients with follicular lymphoma, and the results are extremely gratifying. In fact, we have a number that we're getting our follow-up CTs on as we speak, or that we've received them, and we plan to be publishing a cohort, go back to the British Medical Journal with a series of these patients, and hopefully that will help us justify a clinical trial, because we believe this is a condition that will respond well. We had, this was an interesting case published in 2016. This was a dentist who suffered a brain trauma, had 16 years of continuous headache, and underwent fasting for 41 days, followed by a 6-month period of refeeding, and then another 40-day fast. Post-fasting, this patient is now gone. This study, it said 6 years, but we have a follow-up on her at 8 years now without any residual cephalgia. We also were able to treat successfully a patient with subacute appendicitis that was told to go to surgery, but rather than do surgery, we did fasting. And I'm happy to say years later, he continues to have his appendix. This was a case of hydronephrosis, urotectasis, and partial regression of an unspecified retroperitoneal mass. This individual had been on a vegan diet for a couple of years, but still had obesity and hypertension and hypothyroidism, and had recently had intra-abdominal pain, which was discovered to be a mass. In order to determine whether the mass was a cancerous mass or fibrosis, they needed to do a biopsy, but it's a delicate biopsy because of its location. There was a delay of 30 days before they could schedule that, and so during that time, we went through medically supervised fasting. During the fast, that lasted 13 days with 11 days of recovery, they dropped their weight from 105 kilograms to 98, their blood pressure normalized, and when they went back in for their follow-up CT, the mass had reduced to the point where there was nothing left to biopsy. So that was gratifying. This was a case of seborrheic keratosis, real simple. This was an individual who had a lesion on their face they didn't like, and post-fasting that fell off during fasting, which often happens to various skin lesions. And this was the follow-up. There's a number of other studies. I want to stop now so that we'll have time to take some questions. But I would tell you, for those of you who wanted to see the rest of our published case reports and studies, that you can go to our website at fasting.org, which is the website of the TrueNorth Health Foundation. And all of those are readily available. I also wanted to mention, if any of you are physicians and you'd like to do something worthwhile with your life and get a chance for once to see people get well, we do offer internship and residency training. There's no cost to the doctors. We provide room and board and training, and particularly interested in people interested in research. great opportunity to do human subject research, you can come to TrueNorth Health, and we have a 70-bed inpatient facility where we're doing active human subject trials. We have resources available that are vegan, SOS-free cookbooks. If some of you are wondering how to cook without the salt or the oil, those are readily available. And you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions like, would fasting be appropriate for you? We offer a no-cost phone conversation with me. You can go to our website, complete the registration forms at TrueNorthHealth.com. And then, as I said, I'm happy to speak with you on the phone to help determine whether it's TrueNorth Health Center or some other facility, we can refer you to a local facility that does fasting supervision. We'd be happy to help you with that. With that, I'm hoping that we can open up the opportunity for questions.
We sure will, Dr. Goldhamer. Thank you very much for this entire presentation. It's a wealth of information that we all really are privileged to hear. So thank you. Before we jump into our live Q&A, just want to make sure everybody knows how we go about that here. And so we normally don't take questions directly from the chat box. We ask everyone to raise their hand in case any of you out there, and I already see some hands coming in, so thank you, everyone. In case you don't know how to raise your virtual hand, what you do is you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see different tabs. One of those tabs is called your Reactions tab. You click on your Reactions tab, you'll see some emojis, and one of them says Raise Hand. You click on that function, and we will see your hand raised. And we'll take the hands raised in order in which we receive them. I'll go ahead and unmute you and call you by name, and Dr. Goldhamer will go ahead and answer your questions. All set, Doctor?
Ready to go.
Excellent, thank you. And so with that, I'm going to call in our first question from Michelle. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Goldhamer. I've been following you a long time. I'm a registered holistic nutritionist, and I'm just curious about water fasting. If you are a healthy person with no chronic disease and no history of a chronic disease, and you just want to do it to get the benefits of autophagy, is there a taper off of the diet into the water fast? I'm assuming you don't go cold turkey, and then a gradient tapering back on to regular feeding, correct?
Well, that's a really, really good question. I'm so glad you asked that. In fact, I forgot to mention that we recently have gotten data back on a study where we looked at healthy people and what happens to healthy people when they fast. And as powerful as the biomarker changes are in sick people, it turns out the changes in healthy people are in some cases even more profound. It may be that the people that get the most benefit from fasting are actually healthy people looking to use fasting preventatively. And so that's something that we're going to be exploring in much more detail with a much bigger N here later in the year. But the preliminary data is very, very powerful. And yes, it's very important that the lead in and the recovery from fasting be done properly. The lead in to fasting is very important, particularly the 48 hours before you initiate fasting. It needs to be fruit, salad, and steamed vegetables exclusively. No coffee, alcohol, animal foods, no processed, no last chance to have chocolate cheesecake. If you lead in properly with fruit, salad, and steamed vegetables, the likelihood of complications in fasting go down tremendously. And also you can get right into the process and not have to go through as much hell of adaptation, especially things like caffeine withdrawal are very uncomfortable. You don't want to do that at the same time you're trying to adapt to a fasting process. So the lead in, very important, and most important is recovery after fasting. And particularly long-term fasting, too rapid a return to feeding can result in very serious or even life-threatening events. Refeeding syndrome can come up if you take a long fast and do too rapid a recovery into refeeding. We use a day of juice for every 7 days to 10 days of water fasting, a day of raw fruits and vegetables for every 7 to 10 days of fasting, a day of raw fruits, vegetables, and steamed vegetables for every 7 to 10 days of fasting. So on a fast, it takes about half the length of the fast to recover. So a 20-day fast would have 10 days of progressive refeeding before you would return to normal ad libitum whole plant food SOS-free diet. And that recovery time is where most of the complaints we get from people that are trying to fast on their own and stuff get into trouble. Most of the complications come not so much the fasting, but because of inappropriate refeeding. And it does absolutely need to be done properly. The best way to fast is actually in one of the facilities around the world that specialize in fasting supervision. However, if people do want to fast remotely, there's a protocol you can follow that will improve the likelihood of your success. We actually have doctors through our telemedicine practice where people can go on to work with a doctor remotely that will work with your local doctor in helping you make sure a history exam and lab have been completed and that you're able to be monitored appropriately so it's done safely. And so we do have doctors that offer those services. And also we have doctors that if you just need to talk to about, in understanding your lab results or recommendations that have been given to you by a more conventional physician, you want to know what your options and opinions are, you can check in with us. We have medical doctors, chiropractors, osteopaths, naturopaths, psychologists that are not idiots. It's a really novel opportunity to talk to doctors that actually have the experience of seeing people get well. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of that. You can access that through our website.
Excellent, Dr. Goldhamer. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to Sophia. I'm unmuting you now. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer, for all you are doing for us. I'm vegan and I eat a very healthy plant-based diet. I do 16 intermittent fasting hours as you advise us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I successfully got a phone call with you to join TrueNorth Health Center, but unfortunately, due to COVID, I couldn't do. My issue is knee synovial inflammation, and I lately developed like bumps called toffee, and I wonder if there is a way to safely get rid of them. Chiropractors couldn't help me, unfortunately. And I also have gastritis. I tried to eat a lot of veggies to help with this. And my hope is to reschedule an appointment and to go to TrueNorth Health Center.
Yeah, so I would definitely, it would be nice to review your full medical history. So if you haven't done so already, you go onto our website, complete what are called the registration forms. That gets us your medical history. And then I'll be happy to speak with you without cost to determine who would be the best person to help you, either whether it's come to the center, do something on your own, make the dietary changes. If there's somebody close to you, we'll match you up with them. If not, we'll have one of our doctors that can work with you remotely.
That's amazing, Dr. Goldhamer, that you guys do that. And so thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and move on now to Stephanie. Let's see. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Dr. Goldhamer. Thank you so much for taking time to answer our questions.
My pleasure.
So last year when I was doing like a raw vegan kind of cleanse and juicing, I decided I kind of wanted to delve into complete fasting. So one day a week, I decided to just do electrolyte, like just do water. And I noticed, because I take my blood pressure every morning. That's one of the things I was trying to kind of get rid of, was the high blood pressure. And I noticed the day after the complete fast, my blood pressure would be higher.
Yes.
And in the days where I was eating, it was like normalized. So it made me terrified to go into maybe 2 days or 3 days or go harder into it. So have you ever seen that before?
Yeah, of
and
course.
do you have any advice on how to move forward with fasting?
Yeah, so that's absolutely one of the reasons why we recommend 16 hours a day as a cap for most people at home, 16 hours every day. And then occasionally you do a longer fast in a controlled setting, because the initial adaptation to fasting is the most expensive time, that first 48 hours or so. So if you're constantly banging on the system with 48-hour fast, what happens is you tend to get higher ratios of protein mobilized and not the efficiency that happens with a longer term fast. So in your case, I'd recommend you do 16 hours fasting every day, eat a whole plant food SOS-free diet every day. You should be seeing your weight drop consistently, on average about 2 pounds a week if you're overweight, and your blood pressure is going to be dropping proportionally. And then at some point, if there's a little block there or you want to make it happen quicker, then you take some time off and do a longer term fast. But I can assure you that in a controlled setting with proper lead-in, that blood pressure pattern is very predictable and drops. As I said in our study, 174 out of 174 people normalized pressure without the need for meds. I doubt that you're going to be an exception.
Thank you.
What happens in that early phase fasting is sympathetic tone is higher, so there's vasoconstriction, the blood pressure temporarily goes up, but it's a transient effect, and then it normalizes once people get into a resting state.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Goldhamer. Up next, we have Monty. Monty, welcome.
Hi. So I think this is the best, fasting is the best solution to the modern dilemma among most of us today. And I think this presentation was one of the most consummate one. However, I fasted for about 10 days when I was much younger, and I lost almost all the weight. I mean, I just drank some coconut water with a couple of with bee pollen. But now I'm almost 50 years of age. It's one of the hardest things. I have lost the willpower to fast, and even when I try, it becomes very difficult. Can you tell me what makes it so much more difficult to do so? And question two, what's the most comprehensive scientific based book that we can find on fasting? And three, can we use herbal teas if we are fasting? Is it?
Well, no, we recommend not to use anything during fasting, including coconut water, bee vomit, herbal teas, or anything else. And there's even the smallest amount of carbohydrate alters the fasting adaptation. So we recommend that if fasting is going to be done, it be done right. As far as books, the book that I like the most is a book called The Pleasure Trap. And the last third of it deals with fasting. I think you'll enjoy that. Another book is by Joel Fuhrman, who's a medical doctor, actually did an internship with us when he was a medical student. He wrote an excellent book, A Medical Doctor's Guide to Overcoming Chronic Disease on fasting. And so Dr. Fuhrman, Fuhrman, is another good book. We also have a number of excellent articles that are present on TrueNorthHealth.com that you can go to the library page, and there's all kinds of articles freely available that you can download, including all of our studies. And if you go to the Foundation's website at fasting.org, that's nothing but a fasting compendium site. It has everything, not just our stuff, but other people's stuff on fasting. And so again, great resources for you to learn more about that. And again, safe for everybody to do 16 hours a day. And then when it comes time to do a longer fast, remember history, exam, lab, and monitoring. Whether you're doing it at a facility or you're doing it with your local doctor, you still need to make sure that those issues have been properly addressed in order to ensure it's going to be safe and effective for you.
Excellent, Doctor. Thank you very much for that. We're going to move on now to Dave F. Hi, Dave. Welcome.
Hi. Hi, Dr. Goldhamer. Thank you again for having the lecture. It's great. I read your book. I've been eating whole foods, plant-based for about 5 years, 41 years old. I don't have any health issues, and I do try to do intermittent fasting throughout the day, or, eating once a day. But my question is, I feel like there's so many healthy foods that we should be eating. And when I do eat, some days I'll eat more than once, but I'll eat like a lunch of, let's say, oatmeal or something with blueberries and some fruit. And I feel like I'm missing out on all the greens and salads. But later on in the day, when I do want to eat, or when I should be eating, I force myself to eat because I don't necessarily have the hunger. So I'm almost forcing myself to get out of that fast where I can technically fast another 24 hours. So my question is it better to keep fasting, or is it better to break the fast so that I get my greens and my G-bombs in, so to speak?
Well, I think you should fast 16 hours every day and then eat 3 healthy meals, including the greens. And just because you had oatmeal and fruit doesn't keep you from also having some celery and cucumbers and greens with that. In fact, we like including raw vegetable materials with fruit because the fiber in the vegetables, which is one of the important things, helps slow down the rate with which the sugars absorbed, and then there's less insulin response, and then people don't get the binging and the craving and having difficulty regulating their dietary effects. And so I would say always include greens with your meals, even if you are having say fruit and oatmeal. There's nothing that keeps you from including some greens with that as well. In fact, you may get that you'll really like that. But if you have low density, high nutrition foods and you fill up the feeding bag 3 times a day, you'll get enough calories to maintain optimum weight, not necessarily current weight if it's excessive. So if you're a male, you can expect to lose about 3 pounds a week doing that with moderate activity. And then, as I said, if you need to do a longer fast, just make sure history exam labs suggest that it's a good candidate and you do it in a resting state.
Thank you very much for that. We have another raised hand. This is Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question, and thank you so much for your time. So this might be repetitive, but my question is more about intermittent fasting. I decided for the beginning of the month, for the first 3 days, I wanted to do a fasting where I would only have like 1 large meal a day and for the first 3 days, and then I'm plant-based, whole food plant-based. But what I'm doing in addition to water, and I just heard you talk about herbal teas, like I'll do ginger teas or turmeric teas or those kind of things. But also I drink chicory, which I will put either organic soy milk in or almond milk. Are you saying that that's really technically not even fasting because I'm adding those things to the chicory?
It's not fasting, but it may be a helpful low-calorie intervention for you. I have no problem with that. People can reduce their calories to 600, 750 calories for a day or two. It may facilitate weight loss. They're not going to get the physiological stresses associated with fasting because they're getting enough glucose to meet their protein needs. You know, they're not going to force the protein through gluconeogenesis to be mobilized. And so that's where intermittent fasting and a lot of protocols are out there. Volter, Longo, and others have different protocols. I'm not arguing against that. That's just not the same thing as fasting. It's a fasting mimicking effect. And the mimicking effect is that when you're in ketosis, there's a hunger blunting effect. That's how these high protein, high fat diets get people to temporarily lose weight, is because they blunt the hunger with the fasting mimicking effect. But it's not fasting, and that's not necessarily a good long-term health strategy. Actually, fasting induces not just a hunger blunting effect, but all the other mechanisms that I've talked about today. So let's not assume that fasting mimicking is the same as fasting. They all may have important roles. They may be beneficial. I got no problem with you doing what you're describing as a way of regulating calories and moving you in the right direction. In fact, I'd rather see you do that than say water only and not get the rest and support that you actually need to do it safely.
Very helpful, Doctor. Thank you. We're going to move back to Stephanie now. Hi, Stephanie.
Hey, I just had a quick question. How do you feel about using electrolytes in the water to prevent dehydration during fasting? Like, I've heard a lot of people say you need to put Celtic sea salt in your water when you fast so you don't dehydrate. Is that true?
Do you also need to put cocaine in the water so that you don't get fatigued? No, I would argue against putting chemicals in the water, including Celtic sea salt or any other salt. It's very important when you're doing fasting to realize that when we're monitoring fasts, there are certain minerals that we can monitor, like potassium and sodium. There's many things you won't be able to routinely monitor. What we've learned is that there are certain minerals, as long as those are the rate limiting nutrients, you avoid the dangers of depletion downstream. So it's important that we don't let our arrogance exceed our ignorance when we're doing fasting and say, well, potassium is low, so we'll just supplement potassium and pretend that everything will be okay. That may not be okay at all, because now instead of potassium being a rate limiting nutrient that prevents you from getting depletion of things you're not able to monitor, you put yourself at risk. So we don't recommend adding salt during fasting or any other time. We want the sodium you get to be from the whole foods that you eat. You don't need to add salt to your food any more than you need to add sugar to your food, and you need to add oil to your food. You get all the essential nutrients, the fatty acids, the protein, the sugars from a whole plant food SOS-free diet. And fasting is no exception for that.
Thanks very much for that. And now we've got...
I just want to mention that the reason why people get dehydrated isn't because they lack Celtic sea salt. It's because they're too active or not drinking water. So if people are too active and they become depleted, that's a problem. And it's not going to be corrected because we put some salt in the water.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's excellent. Now we're going to move on to Juliet. Hi, Juliet. Welcome.
Hi. I have Hashimoto, and is it safe for me to just not take my thyroid medication and just go on a fast?
Well, it's interesting with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is an autoimmune disease. That means your immune system destroyed your thyroid. And many people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis have what's called the HLA-DQ gene. And that's the same gene associated with gluten sensitivity. And the theory is that when people eat gluten, which is the protein found in wheat, rye, and barley, some people don't do well with it and they develop celiac disease. The immune system attacks their intestinal tract, very serious disease, and they know they have to not eat wheat. Well, some people's immune system doesn't attack their digestive system, but it attacks their thyroid. And that's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So the first thing we'd recommend is not eating wheat, rye, barley, or glutinous products for people that have that problem. And if you're fasting, it depends on if your thyroid replacement, how long you've been on thyroid replacement. If you've been on thyroid replacement for a while, it's likely that you'll always be on some level of replacement therapy. You may not completely normalize your thyroid function, even with fasting. And the protocol that we follow is we typically reduce thyroid dosing we do testing, proper thyroid panel. We reduce the dosing in half and fast people on half dose, and then retest and determine whether the dose needs to go up or down, depending on how they respond. Some people, you can eliminate it. Some people, you can keep it on a reduced level. Some people have to go back to the level they were before fasting. The danger in fasting is that thyroid medications can be potentiated and may cause palpitations and other potential problems. So we don't want to see that happen. On the other hand, if you just arbitrarily discontinue it, you may be fine for a little while because the stuff stays in your system for a while, but hypothyroidism isn't a very pleasant experience either. So we kind of balance that. But again, you want to be monitored properly with appropriate blood testing before, after, and then on follow-up. So you definitely want to work with a doctor that's familiar with people getting well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldhamer. We've now got a question coming in from Toya. Welcome.
Yes, hi. So I'm doing plant-based as well, SOS free. What I want to know about the iodine, since I'm not doing the salt, I know a lot of people do the dulce. Can I do the drops? Because I purchased the drops that I can just put in my water.
Mm-hmm.
Is
so
that
first
enough?
of all, if you get a food that's not just grown in the Midwest, where the soils tend to be iodine deficient, natural foods generally have decent iodine in them. If you want to supplement that with some sea vegetables, particularly kelp and dulse, which is very low in sodium, your nori sheets are another source of iodine. You can also supplement iodine. It's whether it's iodine drops or whether it's iodine supplements. For most people, they're going to maintain normal levels from a high vegetable content, mixed diet. But certainly, I wouldn't see any problem with supplementing with some kelp noodles or some nori sheets or some other things as a part of the diet. Just be careful that these sea vegetables also can be very high in sodium, so you don't want to get too carried away with that. They even make like kelp powders now that you can just sprinkle a little kelp on the dried kelp on the salad.
I think that's what I was afraid of, how much I was putting on top. And that's why I thought maybe with the drops, it would have the exact amount. So yeah. I don't want to get carried away with too much because I'm hearing different things about having a lot and,
Right. Yeah, understood. And I agree. That's always a danger anytime you start supplementing things. But, I think 2 nori sheets, which is very low in sodium, less than 10 milligrams sodium, has, equivalent of a day's worth of iodine in it. So, it doesn't take very much of this stuff in order to be able to meet your needs. And particularly remember that vegetables grown in soil that's not depleted in iodine generally have iodine levels. The only thing about iodine that's unique is that plants don't have to have it. And so they'll only have it if the soil has it. And so if you live in Minnesota and all of your food came from Minnesota, you wouldn't necessarily have enough iodine unless you fortify the soil with some seaweed and things of that nature.
Thank you very, very much for that, Dr. Goldhamer. Folks, we still have room for questions, so we're looking for more raised hands if you'd like to come in. I've definitely got some questions for you now, if that's okay. Actually, it looks like Toya has another quick follow-up. I'm sorry I lowered you too fast, Toya. Let's go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to ask about B12 as well. And also I started this journey, Dr. Goldhamer, because of you, just watching YouTube. So I'm very excited for that, and I'm pretty young, so I'm just happy to start this journey.
So B12 is really important. Yeah, very, very important question. I should have mentioned that. It was my negligence. So there's only one nutrient that really is a problem long-term for vegans, and that's B12. B12 only comes from bacteria. So people that are eating lots of meat are also getting a lot of bacterial exposure, not the least of which is from all the feces that's generally associated with meat consumption. So they're going to get a lot of bacterial contamination, a lot of B12. But people on a vegan diet, particularly those that wash and peel and are trying to avoid parasites and worms and other things by using good hygienic measures, will not get much bacterial contamination. And as a consequence, they will not get much B12. And over enough years, you can actually become depleted in B12 if you don't supplement it. We recommend 1,000 micrograms of methylcobalamin a day. That's the amount of B12 that would fit on the head of a pin. It's a very small amount. There are companies like Pure Encapsulations that make a liquid version that you can use. You can get a vegan capsule from them, from methylcobalamin. And lots of different companies make vitamin B12. I would go with a known brand name just because quality control is a little better. Occasionally, some of the stuff that's coming from China or some other places hasn't actually had anything in it. They're just selling capsules. But anyway, so that is something we do recommend. 1,000 micrograms a day will meet virtually everybody's needs, even people with digestive challenge and other problems orally. It generally doesn't have to be injected because oral B12, even but with poor absorption, there's a diffusion of about 2%. So 1,000 micrograms would get about 20 micrograms across the border, and that's 10 times the amount that's actually needed for minimal intake. So vitamin B12 is the one nutrient we recommend routine supplementation of. The other one that's common is D. Normally you make plenty of D by getting out in the sun, but a lot of people are not out in the sun, or they live so far north that they don't make sun most of the year. And so those individuals, if their blood levels suggest that their vitamin D level, if the 25 dehydroxyvitamin D is too low, then we would supplement that at the least amount necessary to get them normal. D, unlike B12, is fat soluble, so you can get too much of it. B12, you're going to end up making expensive urine if you take too much, but it's not going to necessarily cause you harm.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Goldhamer. And now we've got some more hands coming in, so I'm going to go next to Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. Every time I hear you talk, I learn a little bit more. I have a question about the D3. You hit on vitamin D. I read that vitamin D really should be taken with meals and food to be properly absorbed. I live in the Northeast, so I supplement with vitamin D in the winter. How would you do a water fast and do vitamin D supplementation?
You do not supplement during fasting. There's no supplementation used during fasting. There's nothing except distilled water. So water fasting is just that, fasting on everything except water, fasting from everything, including no supplementation. You do not need to take B12 or D during fasting. This is going to be a relatively brief period of time, from 5 to 40 days. Your adequate stores going into the fast will be recycled and utilized effectively during fasting. Fasting is remarkable. You'll live longer on a water fast than you might, for example, on a white bread only diet. You'd actually develop deficiencies on refined carbohydrate diet. You wouldn't with fasting. Fasting, the recycling and very efficient. And so no supplementation during fasting. And you're right. The only way you can make D during a fast would be get out in the sun a little bit. You'll make a little bit of D that way.
Got it. Thank you.
But don't stay out too long because you don't want to dehydrate. That's the only real issue with fasting is you can get dehydrated if you get too active.
Thanks again. And up next we have Lorraine. Hi, Lorraine. Oh, hang on. Let me try to unmute you. Lorraine, I'm going to unmute you. Let's go. Oh, no.
Thank you so much for all your great information. I started whole plant eating about 3.5 months ago, doing great. I do intermittent fasting about 20 hours a day, and I'm feeling fabulous. But you were mentioning, and I have high triglycerides and 6.1 A1C, but that was 3 months ago. I'm going to be tested again next month. I heard you say about the 700 a day calorie. I'm wondering what you think of eating oatmeal, 3 ounces of blueberries, and a lot of green vegetables, of course, and chia seeds or hemp seeds, maybe 3 tablespoons. That would add up to about the 700 calories.
Yeah, that would be too much fat from my viewpoint, especially for a person with insulin resistance like yourself. What I would recommend is you do your oatmeal, your blueberries, your tablespoon of ground flax or hemp or whatever it is, and then you have 2 huge salads during the day, maybe even some steamed vegetables. And that'll get you your 700 calories as well. Salad with 100 calories a pound, you'll get a couple hundred calories there, a pound of fruit and greens. And always take lots of greens with your fruit so the blood sugar absorbs, more slowly and doesn't give you too much of an issue there. And if you need a little bit more caloric density, some more steamed greens would be fine. So, that would be a way of meeting it. I wouldn't necessarily get too carried away with the higher fat foods because you may find that contributes to a little bit of insulin resistance if you get too aggressive with it.
Thanks, Doctor. Looks like we have Dave back. I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Dave.
Hello. Got another follow-up question. Hopefully that I ask it correctly. So, Dr. Goldhamer, I wanted to understand if you've seen this with your patients in the sense of, so when they do fast for more than 24 hours, I've noticed that my bowel movements are, I do eat a lot of fiber. I do eat a lot of salad, but I've noticed I get constipated after about a day or two if I do fast. Is that something normal?
Are you saying, when you say constipated, are you saying that you stop having bowel movements, or do the stools get very dry?
When I don't fast, I use the restroom a couple times throughout the day. But when I do fast, for more than 24 hours, I've noticed the next day it's almost like I don't go for a very long.
Of course, because when you're fasting, you're not introducing fiber, you're not stimulating peristalsis. And so once you get into the fast and the last material has been eliminated, you won't have more bowel movements until it's time to start refeeding. For example, on a 40-day fast, a person might have a bowel movement in the early phase. There might even be one during the fast if enough material accumulates, but they wouldn't have bowel movements the rest of the time, which is fine. The bowels are designed to have some residual material in them all the time. They always do. Your bowels always have materials in them. There's no auto absorption problems if the stuff that you're putting in isn't a problem. And so by doing 2 days of refeeding, pre-feeding properly, the only residual materials in the stools are going to be a little bit of fiber and perhaps a little stercobilinogen and other material from the liver that's excreted, but it's going to be minimal. And then once you start eating again and you get your normal microflora reestablished, then bowel movements will begin to recover. And in fact, even people with long histories of chronic constipation often resolve it completely post-fasting. Remember, when you look at a stool, mostly the stool, some of it's fiber and water, but mostly it's bacteria. And so when you go on a fast and there's this big drop down in the gut microbiome and this big rebooting of the environment, the cessation of bowel function is entirely and completely normal. Most of your toxins are not eliminated in the bowels. That's the stuff that never got in your body. Most of the toxins are the blood being purified by the kidneys, and that shows up in the urine. And that's why we're always busy monitoring urine flow during fasting. We're not too much worried about the bowel function.
Thank you very much for that. And now we have Janet, and welcome, Janet.
Hi, thank you. I had a question for you. If you do have insulin resistance and blood sugar issues, fasting is very difficult for me. I find, does it stabilize over time, or in the beginning it just feels like overwhelming, like you have to eat something, your heart starts beating quickly. And
so the important thing there is, this is a very big problem. And, we treat a lot of very severe diabetics and all the rest of it. And so the important thing is the proper lead in. So you don't go from 0 to 100. You don't just go from conventional eating to fasting overnight. You have to do a proper lead in. And for some diabetics, it'll take us several days or even a week to get them stabilized enough that they're ready to fast. And if your hemoglobin A1C is over 10, you probably want to be making diet and lifestyle changes before you undertake fasting. So you have to have there's certain parameters that we follow to make that transition easier. But even said that, the first couple of days of fasting are the hardest part, and then it stabilizes, blood sugar levels stabilize, and usually people do quite well. We've had 39 years of fasting people. We've had 21,000 patients undergo fasting. And so far, everybody that's walked in has walked out, and we're trying to insist on keeping that safety record.
That's a good record. Thank you for that, Doctor. I'm going to bring up now David A. Hi, David.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I just had, let's see, my first question is, should you undergo fasting if you're underweight, number one? And number two, another speaker suggested you should take sea salt, a little bit of sea salt, lemon juice. Otherwise, during fasting, you won't get enough electrolytes and you'll be too weak.
Okay, well, I totally disagree with that. As I said, we've done 21,000 people and we've never used sea salt, and we don't give, anything else. Otherwise, it's not really fasting. And the fact is, people do go through periods of weakness. That's entirely possible during fasting, and then they normalize. And, if you come to the TrueNorth Health Center, you'll find people attending classes and doing all kinds of stuff, even 20, 30 days into the fast. So the idea that people can't adapt to fasting properly is not true. They are able to do that. So supplemented fasting, different situation. What was the other question?
The other question is, if you're underweight, should you undergo fasting?
So we try not to fast people whose BMI is less than 16. That's kind of a target. And if a person comes in under 16, if possible, we'll build them up first with careful refeeding. And when you're trying to build somebody up, you're doing the exact opposite of what you're often doing when you're trying to lose weight. When you're trying to lose weight, you eat whole food. When you're trying to gain weight, sometimes we'll process the food a little bit more. We might make juice, so carrot juice instead of carrots. We might make rice pasta instead of brown rice. We might do a blended salad instead of a large salad. So the idea is to improve the absorbability, which is the opposite of what you're trying to do when you're trying to lose weight. You give people whole rice instead of rice pasta. You don't use the more concentrated foods. So we may shift the food itself. we get people to chew their food properly, which stimulates the digestive secretions, which allows for absorption. In the most difficult cases, sometimes we'll actually resort to some nutritional medicine, supplementation issues with enzymes and other things to try to get them to absorb enough nutrients so that they can build their reserves up so they have the capacity to undergo fasting. And then you use short periods of fasting for the purpose of rebooting the gut microbiome, detoxifying, and improving absorption. So sometimes brief periods of fasting followed by careful feeding actually allows us to build people up. As I mentioned, even normally with fasting, lean tissue is actually higher at 6 weeks post-fasting than it was before fasting. So even though it seems weird to use fasting in a person that's thin, sometimes that's the person that can get significant benefit if it's done properly.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldhamer. And Stephen F. is back. Hi, Stephen. Welcome.
Hey, Dr. Goldhamer. Nice to see you again. It's Yussie's dad.
Hi.
Sent Yussie to you twice. Been through all this, doing okay. On the other side of reversing autoimmune, I'm freezing. Help.
Yeah. So this is a problem. As people lose their subcutaneous fat, they no longer have the insulation that allowed them to tolerate cold. And also, there's when you're actively losing weight, there's a peripheral shunting of blood into the core to protect your organs. And so, although once you reach optimum weight and stabilize, it may become less of an issue. And as you get healthier and you get better peripheral circulation, the ability to transfer blood, which carries the heat, may improve with time. In the meantime, you're going to have to resort to using what are known as clothes. And so sometimes it might mean a jacket or, if you're outside, maybe even a pair of mittens, so that you maintain a comfortable temperature until your body goes through this adaptation. The healthier people get, the better their capacity is to adapt to, their temperature and regulation. But it is a problem for people who've lost a lot of subcutaneous fat and no longer are functioning with the same level of insulation that they used to have.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. We now have Sharon with a raised hand. I'll unmute you. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, this has been very interesting and I've been following you, doctor, and I had tried to come to your clinic, but I was only 99 pounds at the time. So, but I've had mantle cell lymphoma twice. The first time, which I didn't want to do it conventionally to treat it, but I had to do it radiation the first time. It was on my eye. And the second time it was on my other eye and the back of my tongue. And I did chemo, which I didn't want to do, but nothing was working. And so I am on a whole food plant-based diet actually in 2012, I went raw vegan, but now I'm just whole food. I cook my food, everything, beans, nuts, all that. But recently I had a thyroid test and they just did the TSH and the range was 0.40 to 4.0 and mine's 4.25.
Yeah.
And I have been emotional. I don't want to go anywhere, do anything. I'm sad. And I'm thinking maybe that's what's causing it. And I take Dr. Furman's multivitamin. It has 150 micrograms of iodine.
Yeah.
Should I take more iodine or less iodine? I don't know what to do.
Well, what I would do if I were you actually is it's not going to be necessarily taking more iodine that's going to be the issue. There's lots of variables that affect the neuroendocrine system. But what I would suggest you do is hook up with one of our doctors, maybe Chilla Varas. She's a woman doctor that does a lot of phone and Zoom support, and she can help you get into the whole neuroendocrine system. Now, there's a lot more than thyroid involved. I don't know if they've done a proper panel or not, but she can help you figure out why is it you're running on the edge there. Sometimes it's people are stressed out or fatigued, or there's other variables, but I wouldn't necessarily start pumping more iodine in until you've really had a decent assessment. Make sure that we have copies of all your current lab records emailed to office@truenorthhealth.com. Go onto the website and set up something with Dr. Varas or one of the other doctors, and they'll help you get into the weeds of trying to figure out exactly what you can do that you're not already doing.
Excellent. Thank you, doctor. At the moment, that's our last hand. We have a few more minutes. I've got a bunch of questions I'd love to ask you. If anybody else does have a question along the way, please feel free to raise your hand again and we'll try to get right back to you. Dr. Goldhamer, you talked about iodine, you talked about B12 and vitamin D, D3. And in case anybody else missed it, what other supplements are at the top of your list for folks that you just highly recommend?
Well, I recommend people eat a whole plant food diet and try to minimize the pills and potions as much as possible. The exceptions we talked about, B12 for vegans, vitamin D if you don't get out in the sun enough to have normal levels, iodine if you're eating soil that doesn't have adequate, for most of our patients, they're eating so much vegetable materials, it's really not a huge problem for most of them. There is theoretical issues though. Some people that, for example, nuts might be a food trigger for them. They're trying to lose weight. They don't want to eat nuts and seeds so DHA or docosahexaoxalic acid theoretically could be an issue. And so there are vegan supplements for DHA that can be used if people are having problems associated with low levels because they're not able to get those fat-rich foods in the diet because they're having challenges or they're going through weight loss issues. But again, I think the focus needs to be on whole foods, not on pills. It's really easy to get into pills that they don't make up for not eating a whole food diet. And when people do eat a proper diet, the need for supplementation is dramatically reduced.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. And we now have a few more hands coming in. So I'm going to go over to Paul. Paul, welcome.
Well, thank you for your presentation. My question is about for people that might be underweight, could juice fasting be a benefit, or you don't recommend juice fasting at all?
Well, juice fasting and water fasting can both be useful for underweight people, but the challenge with underweight people is you don't want to get them depleted. And so juice fasting wouldn't necessarily have the same effects that water fasting would. So the real question is if a person's are they really underweight? If they are underweight and they're having fatigue and energy issues, what can we do to build them up? And, juice fasting wouldn't necessarily have the same recalibrating effect that a water fast would, but it might be helpful in other areas. So each of them has their application. The bigger issue with underweight is what's preventing absorption taking place. And that microbiome imbalance may be part of it. That's where a short fast sometimes can be helpful. For example, the same diet after a short fast often results in people being able to then regain weight. And it's not because the diet's changed, it's because the organisms that are in the gut that are involved with the digestion change. So again, I always want to try to figure out what is it that's getting a person overweight or what is it that's keeping a person underweight, and try to get to the reason why that might be happening. And to the extent that fasting might be a useful tool, that's great, but usually that's not the only issue. It's usually more complicated than that. And honestly, it's a lot easier to treat people that are overweight and get them to lose weight than it is to treat people that are underweight to help them overcome the imbalances that are preventing them from absorbing what they're eating properly.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Goldhamer. And up next, we have Steve, I believe. I'm going to ask you to unmute Steve.
Yes, Dr. Goldhamer. Brian Clement has made for a long time said that fruit feeds yeast, mold, fungus, cancer, and that it's picked unripe. And he's very, very passionate and strong about this. And it's in opposition to what most of the other speakers say, all of the other speakers, except for Gabriel Cousins. I'm wondering why there's such a disconnect. Like, why is he continue to feel that fruit has this issue that it feeds cancers, and even says that Thomas Seyfried agrees with him? What is your thought?
Well, I'm not sure it's that simple. So we know that I think that's an overinterpretation of the book and the doctor that he's referring to. But so I think he's right that if fruit is unripe, it can be a challenge for all people. That too much fruit, particularly when it's processed in the form of juices and dried fruits, can present a high sugar load with a minimal mineral content. The fruit that we eat today is hybridized, high sugar, low mineral content foods. So I believe that they can be used in the diet healthfully, but they have to be used with some reasonable respect for the fact that these are, very sugar-rich, low-fiber foods. You have to neutralize it with large amounts of vegetable material. So, for example, people that go on fruitarian diets oftentimes develop characteristic problems with teeth, nail, hair, immune suppression, emotional volatility. And then if they just get a lot more mineral content by eating lots of vegetable materials, then that oftentimes can be neutralized. So, but I think what's happened is they've taken some general principles, which is that in the fasting state, which is a ketoacidotic state, which is a high fat state, cancer cells don't do well because they, unlike natural cells that are able to adapt to the fasting state, cancer cells don't. They have a higher metabolic rate, and the fasting state puts cancer cells in a disadvantage. And so they've tried to extend that by doing fasting mimicking diets and keep people in this ketoacidotic state indefinitely. Well, that might have some advantage in terms of managing certain cells like cancer cells, but it also has a disadvantage in terms of overall health. So what our experience is that you can use fasting or maybe even fasting mimicking intervention to try to bring things under control, but the long-term health of the individual is best served with a whole plant food SOS-free diet. Now that in most cases will include some whole fruit, large amounts of vegetable materials, and if you're concerned about blood sugar controls, make sure you avoid dried fruits and fruit juices and stick to the lower glycemic fruits like the berries and the melons, and people will typically do well with that. Having said that, if you're an active diabetic that's not brought your insulin resistance down, you might be better excluding fruit altogether. If you're under active cancer treatment, you might be better excluding fruit altogether for a period of time. And so that may be a therapeutic adaptation that's reasonable for certain people. But for the general health promoting, what do we do to keep people healthy over the long run? Whole fruit, salads, steamed vegetables, potatoes, rice, beans, nuts, and seeds are the basis of the diet that we recommend.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Goldhamer. And when I say thank you, I mean thank you for this entire presentation, for being so gracious with our question and answer forum, and just so much valuable information for all of us. I know I'm not the only one that wants to thank you, though, personally. So we're going to have our tech team unmute everyone. Everyone, what do you want to say to Dr. Goldhamer?
Thank you so much.
Again, thanks again, Dr. Goldhamer. We really do.